For decades, the name Nelson meant wholesome, all-American television. But behind the smiling faces of one of Hollywood's most iconic families was a woman whose life quietly unraveled in front of cameras and later far away from them. Kristin Nelson was married to a teen idol, raised 4 children under constant public scrutiny, and spent years fighting battles that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with survival. This is her story, and the story of the 4 children who had to find their own way through the wreckage she left behind. Kristin Harmon didn't grow up dreaming of ordinary things, because nothing about her childhood was ordinary. Her father, Tom Harmon, was one of the most famous athletes in America. As a running back at the University of Michigan, he won the Heisman Trophy in 1940 and became a household name known simply as Old 98, a nickname tied to his jersey number and his blistering speed on the field. But Tom Harmon's story didn't end on the football field. When World War II broke out, he traded his cleats for a cockpit and became a fighter pilot. He survived 2 separate plane crashes during his service, one over the jungles of South America, where he trekked for nearly 2 weeks before finding rescue, and another over Chinese territory after enemy fire brought his aircraft down. He came home a war hero and quickly became a beloved sports broadcaster, carrying his fame from the gridiron into American living rooms for years to come. Kristin's mother, Elise Knox, was no less accomplished. She had built a career as a film actress throughout the 1940s before choosing to step back from Hollywood to raise her family. Together, Tom and Elise represented a kind of golden age glamour that few families could match, and their 3 children grew up surrounded by privilege, celebrity, and expectation. Kristin was the eldest, followed by her sister Kelly, who would later become recognizable to millions as the face of a well-known candy commercial campaign, and her younger brother Mark, who would go on to spend nearly 2 decades as the lead of a hit primetime crime drama. Kristin attended an elite, all-girls Catholic school in Bel Air, rubbing shoulders daily with the children of other famous families. It was a life that looked, from the outside, like an unbroken string of good fortune. But everything shifted when she was only 12 years old and sat in a television studio audience, catching her first glimpse of a young singer who was quickly becoming the biggest teen idol in the country. She had no way of knowing that the boy on stage would one day become her husband, or that the fairy tale she imagined would eventually collapse under its own weight. That singer was Ricky Nelson, and like Kristin, he had grown up inside a famous household. His father, Ozzie Nelson, was a band leader who married his lead singer, Harriet Hilliard, and the pair eventually built an entire radio and television empire around their real-life family. Their show ran for over a decade, chronicling a fictionalized version of their own household, with young Ricky playing the charming, easygoing little brother that audiences adored week after week. What most viewers never saw was how tightly Ozzie controlled every part of his family's public and private lives. When Ricky was a teenager hoping to impress a girl he liked, he casually claimed he had recorded a song. To back up the bluff, he actually recorded one and performed on the family's television show. The reaction was explosive. Almost overnight, Ricky became a genuine recording star, racking up hit singles and selling records at a pace that rivaled Elvis Presley himself, all while continuing to play the clean-cut boy next door on television every single week. Underneath that image, Ricky was navigating 2 very different identities. He loved raw, rockabilly-inspired music, the kind that didn't always fit neatly into the polished, family-friendly persona his father had built around him. He was, in many ways, a product being managed rather than a young man being allowed to simply grow up. By the time he reconnected with Kristin around the 1961 holiday season, he was already deeply accustomed to keeping his true self hidden behind a carefully maintained public image. The 2 began dating, quickly fell into a serious relationship, and became engaged. Then, unexpectedly, Kristin discovered she was pregnant. In the spring of 1963, 17-year-old Kristin Harmon married 22-year-old Ricky Nelson in a Catholic ceremony in Los Angeles. To the public, it looked like the perfect union between 2 celebrated Hollywood families. In reality, the wedding had been moved up quickly because of Kristin's pregnancy. Ricky, who had not been raised Catholic, was required to take religious instruction and formally commit to raising their future children in the Catholic faith before the church would allow the marriage to proceed. Years later, Ricky would openly admit what many had long suspected. describing the ceremony bluntly as a shotgun wedding. There was barely any time to adjust a married life before Kristin was folded directly into the Nelson family's television machine. She was cast in an episode of the family's long-running sitcom, portraying a version of her own new marriage for a national audience. A teenage girl was now performing her real relationship on a soundstage, week after week, for millions of strangers who expected nothing less than a picture-perfect portrayal of domestic bliss. There was no room for the ordinary friction of a young marriage, no space to simply be a teenager figuring out adulthood. The distinction between her actual home life and the fictionalized version broadcast in the homes across America began to blur almost immediately, and the strain of maintaining that illusion took root early, long before the family they were building had even begun to take shape. Roughly 6 months after their wedding, Kristin gave birth to their first child, a daughter born premature. That daughter would go on to have her own early brush with fame, appearing in a major film alongside a beloved comedic actress before she was even out of grade school. For years later, Kristin gave birth to twin boys. Then, after a gap of several years, a fourth child, a son, completed the family. On paper, it looked like a full and happy household. In practice, the marriage was buckling under pressures that had been building since the earliest days of their relationship. Ricky's music career kept him almost constantly on tour, crisscrossing the country for one performance after another, while Kristin remained at home in Los Angeles managing for young children largely on her own. Rumors of infidelity swirled around his time on the road, and whether or not every rumor held truth, the emotional distance between them was undeniable and growing. Isolated, overwhelmed, and increasingly unhappy, Kristin began turning to alcohol and prescription substances as a way of coping with the loneliness and instability of her daily life. That dependency didn't stay contained. It seeped into the household, creating an unpredictable and often chaotic environment for 4 children who were simply trying to grow up. The marriage, once a partnership in name if nothing else, hardened into something closer to 2 separate lives being lived under one roof out of obligation rather than affection. Ricky leaned further into touring, partly as a means of income and partly, it seemed, as an escape from the tension waiting for him at home. By the mid-1970s, what had started as a teenage romance thrust into spotlight had curdled into a slow, painful unraveling that both of them seemed powerless to stop. By 1975, the marriage existed in name only. Ricky and Kristin still shared a home, but they were living entirely separate existences within it. The breaking point arrived in 1977, when Ricky returned from a tour to discover that Kristin had moved his belongings out of their house entirely, relocating them to a rental property without warning. Later that same year, Kristin formally filed for divorce for the first time, requesting spousal support, full custody of their 4 children, and a division of their shared property. Despite the filing, the two attempted a reconciliation, as couples with years of shared history and children often do. But the underlying issues, addiction on one side and persistent absence on the other, resurfaced quickly. In a strange final attempt to project stability to the outside world, the couple purchased a sprawling estate on Mulholland Drive in 1980, a property that had once belonged to a legendary Hollywood actor of an earlier era. It was an enormous financial gamble for a couple whose marriage was already effectively over and whose finances were far from secure. But appearances mattered deeply to a family that had spent its entire existence under public observation. The illusion didn't last. Just months after buying the estate, Kristin filed for divorce a second time, and this attempt would not be reversed. What followed was nearly 2 years of contentious legal battles that played out in California courtrooms and across the pages of tabloid newspapers. Kristin wanted Ricky to abandon touring altogether and settle into a more conventional role as a present husband and father. Ricky refused, insisting that performing was the only livelihood he knew. A judge eventually granted Kristin temporary custody of the children, along with monthly financial support. But the legal fight dragged on for years before a final settlement was reached in late 1982. By the time it was over, both Ricky and Kristin were financially depleted and emotionally exhausted, having spent well over $1 million combined on lawyers and accountants. Their 4 children, meanwhile, were left to navigate the fallout largely on their own, with living arrangements shifting depending on age, circumstance, and which parent was available at any given moment. Just 3 years after the divorce was finalized, tragedy struck in a way no one could have anticipated. On New Year's Eve of 1985, Ricky Nelson, then 45 years old, was flying with his band from Alabama toward a scheduled New Year's Eve performance in Texas. Their aircraft, an older converted plane that had reportedly experienced mechanical trouble in the days leading up to the flight, caught fire midair. The pilots attempted an emergency landing, but the plane went down before they could reach safety. Ricky, his fiancée, and several members of his band did not survive. Initial speculation pointed toward substance involvement, but official investigations later determined the cause to be a mechanical failure, a faulty heater that ignited leaking fuel. For Kristin, the news landed as a devastating blow despite the fact that they had already been divorced for 3 years. He remained, after all, the father of her children and the man whose life had been intertwined with hers since she was a preteen watching him perform on television. His sudden death closed the door on any possibility of eventual reconciliation or a healthier co-parenting relationship, and instead of drawing the fractured family closer together in grief, it seemed to widen the divide even further. The funeral itself became a painful, public spectacle. Concerned about how her children would be financially provided for going forward, Kristin approached Ricky's brother, who was overseeing the estate, hoping to secure some form of support. The estate, however, had been structured specifically to protect the children directly, and a court ultimately denied Kristin any personal claim to her former husband's assets. The tension boiled over the funeral itself, culminating in a heated, physical altercation between Kristin and her eldest daughter in full view of grieving family and friends. It was a stark, uncomfortable illustration of just how far the family had drifted from the polished image they had once presented to the world. In the years following Ricky's death, Kristin's dependency on prescription medication deepened rather than improved. By 1987, her brother Mark, by then one of the most recognizable actors in Hollywood, grew increasingly alarmed watching his sister spiral. He encouraged her to seek treatment, and she agreed, checking into a chemical dependency program at a well-regarded facility. But while she was away receiving care, Mark and his wife, actress Pam Dauber, made a decision that would ignite a bitter family war. Believing that the youngest of Kristin's 4 children was living in an unstable and unsafe environment, they filed for legal custody of the boy, arguing that Kristin's long struggle with substance abuse made her unfit to provide adequate care. When Kristin completed her treatment and learned that her own brother had attempted to take her youngest son from her, the betrayal cut deep, and she resolved to fight the custody claim with everything she had. The resulting trial, held in a Los Angeles courtroom in the summer of 1987, was a painful, deeply public affair. A child psychiatrist testified about the emotional toll the volatility at home had taken on the boy, describing therapy sessions in which he had depicted his mother through unsettling imagery, a reflection of the unpredictability he lived with day to day. In response, Kristin's legal team threatened to call witnesses connected to Pam Dauber's own television career to testify about substance use they claimed to have witnessed on set years earlier, an aggressive move meant to counter accusations of unfitness with accusations of hypocrisy. Ultimately, Mark could not bring himself to continue subjecting the family to this level of public exposure and humiliation. He withdrew the custody petition before the trial reached its conclusion. The court awarded Kristin custody of her youngest son, granted Mark visitation rights, and ordered the family into mandatory therapy in an attempt to begin repairing what had been broken. After the exhausting and humiliating custody battle with her brother, Kristin made the decision to leave Los Angeles entirely. She relocated to Santa Fe, New Mexico, seeking distance in the industry, the tabloids, and the constant reminders of everything she had lost. In New Mexico, she rediscovered a passion for painting, producing colorful, expressive folk art that seemed to channel the difficult chapters of her past into something tangible and healing. Her work gained genuine recognition among art collectors, and by the late 1990s, she compiled her paintings and personal reflections into a published memoir, finally telling her own story on her own terms rather than through the lens of tabloid coverage. She largely stayed out of the public eye for the remainder of her life, passing away in 2018 following a heart attack at the age of 72. While Kristin was rebuilding a quieter life far from Hollywood, her 4 children were carving out paths of their own, each shaped in different ways by the chaos of their upbringing. Her eldest daughter pursued an acting career and found steady work on television, even continuing to perform through a battle with Hodgkin's lymphoma in her 20s, landing recurring roles on well-regarded shows of the era. Inspired in part by their sister's determination, the twin sons picked up instruments and formed a rock band that achieved genuine commercial success, scoring a chart-topping single at the turn of the 1990s. Their success made the Nelson family the first in American recording history to produce #1 hits across 3 consecutive generations, a remarkable and somewhat improbable legacy for a family whose story had been so defined by turmoil. The youngest son took a different route entirely, pursuing a degree in psychology before eventually finding his own place within the music industry as an executive rather than a performer. In the end, all 4 Kristin and Ricky's children managed to build lives and careers of genuine substance, despite growing up in the shadow of a marriage that had collapsed so publicly and so painfully. They carried the weight of their parents unraveling in different ways, but each of them found a way to move forward. Kristin Nelson's story is, in many ways, a cautionary tale about what happens when a very young woman is thrust into fame, marriage, and motherhood all at once, with little support and even less privacy. Whether her decline was inevitable from the moment she walked down the aisle at 17, or whether a different path might have spared her the years of pain that followed, is a question without a clean answer. What is clear is that her children, despite everything, found their own way through.